Good morning and welcome to Conference Connections. I'm Joe Spitzen, Assistant Manager of the Regional Housing Accelerator Program at Nebraska Investment Finance Authority. With me is John Turner, Manager of Community Development and Research at NIFA. Thank you all for joining us today. Our topic today is fair housing civil rights. This was originally scheduled for last March at our conference, the Housing Innovation Marketplace, but COVID had other plans for us. Since we had a lot of sessions planned and didn't want this great content to fall by the wayside, we've been putting on these weekly live events. You can find links to videos of our previous sessions on NIFA.org and directly on YouTube under NIFA Housing. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted there later today, and links will be posted in the chat. We always have exhibitors and sponsors at the Housing Innovation Marketplace, so I'd like to give some of them a quick shout out. Thank you to Legacy Bank and Trust, Community Development Financing, Omaha City Planning, Grow Nebraska, and the FDIC for sponsoring the conference and for your continued support. We look forward to doing this in person again one day once it is safe and practical to do so. Now to get started, today's presenters are Margie Nichols from the City of Lincoln's Commission on Human Rights, Vic Klafter of Nebraska Appleseed, and Abbi Swatsworth from OutNebraska. Off camera, our moderator today is Joe Garcia. Joe is the program director of the Fair Housing Center of Nebraska, Iowa, a program of the Family Housing Advisory Services Incorporated, the only qualified fair housing enforcement organization in the area. The center operates out of Omaha and serves all of Nebraska and Iowa. In addition, it operates the only testing program in the two-state area that utilizes testing methodology currently approved by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for its use in private enforcement initiatives grants. Joe holds a degree in paralegal studies and joined the center in 2001, serving in several capacities before becoming the program director in 2010. He has over 19 years of direct experience in fair housing investigations and has been instrumental in conducting and analyzing over 2,800 tests in the rental, sales, and lending markets throughout Nebraska and Iowa. Joe has given numerous presentations on fair housing and landlord tenant law and has received specialized training from HUD, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and the National Fair Housing Training Academy. He is bilingual and has significantly increased the fair housing services to the Spanish-speaking immigrants communities in the center's service area. I believe he is speaking in English today for us. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Remind me, I got to cut down that bio.
I actually cut it down a little.
Geez. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to first thank NIFA for putting on this session and realizing the importance of fair housing and civil rights. And considering the current climate of our society, this session is coming at the right time. I'm excited to be a part of this training session and even more excited to hear the three presenters we have for you. Although their fields of expertise lie in different areas, the one common thread is civil rights and fair housing. So that being said, let's get started with our first presenter. Oh, and by the way, they showed my picture up there, and in case anybody was wondering, yes, I'm wearing that same tuxedo for this very prestigious event. Our first presenter, Margie Nichols, serves as Senior Civil Rights Investigator for the City of Lincoln's Commission on Human Rights, a position she's held for more than 12 years. A Nebraska native and farm girl from Byron, Nebraska, Margie graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Journalism from the University of Nebraska at Kearney, is a certified paralegal, Fair Housing Training Academy graduate, and one class away from obtaining her master's in legal studies. In addition to investigating discrimination allegations in housing, employment, and public accommodation, Margie conducts training on fair housing and equal opportunity law. Margie, floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Let me get my slideshow going, and hopefully you can see that. Thank you to NIFA to inviting me to present on today's panel. First, a little bit about our agency. The Lincoln Commission on Human Rights is a neutral fact-finding agency. We have the authority to investigate allegations of discrimination, There we go. Now you can see it. There, try again. You would think we'd all be experts by now in all of these areas with Zoom and GoToWebinar and everything, but no. And as you know, when you saw me, the lighting, yeah, fight with it. Anyway, so again, the Commission on Human Rights is a neutral fact-finding agency, and we have the authority to investigate allegations of discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations that occur within the city of Lincoln. For housing, we have a contract with Housing and Urban Development to investigate cases on their behalf. And what do those cases involve? Well, they have to do with individuals who believe that they have been discriminated against based on one of the protected classes, which those include, race, color, national origin, sex, religion, familial status, and retaliation. Another important component for our agency is our ability to conduct outreach and to provide trainings like this one. We will do that for anybody upon request, and we do it for free. So before I get started and I move on to the next slide, what I'd like to do is have a poll put up, because I'd kind of like to know who is out there. While my presentation is really geared more toward property managers and landlords, I'd kind of like to know, who is all out there. So if you could, if that's open, I can't tell.
Yeah, this is John. Yes, it's open. Looks like right now we have 51% says yes and 49 no.
Oh, half and half. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and this information, though, it's to me it's helpful and relevant to everybody and anybody, because anytime, the more you can know about when it comes to, especially what I'm talking about with assistance animals and disability, and even some on COVID-19, the better you are. So again, those are the two areas that I'm going to talk about. The majority of my presentation is going to be on reasonable accommodation and assistance animals. However, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't at least address COVID-19 a little bit, and most of that is really just on best practices. So when it comes to disability, in January this year, Housing and Urban Development released a really good guidance piece to help individuals navigate reasonable accommodation requests from tenants. It's a 19-page piece, and it leads an individual through a series of questions, and also adds information like definitions and further explanations for a lot of the lingering questions that we get and that people have when it comes to reasonable accommodation. The guidance is divided into two different sections. The first part being assessing the person's request when they put in notice to someone or say, I need to have an emotional support, a therapy animal, a comfort animal, those words, those kind of key words. And then the second part of that is the documentation that you can ask as a housing provider, or if you're the tenant, what kind of documentation that you can provide or would provide. So there are two types of assistance animals. The first being a service animal, which I will talk a little bit more about here in a second. And then the second is what commonly in the past has been referred to as like an emotional support animal. Now we're putting them all under the category of assistance animal, but the emotional support animal, again, is another animal that provides some kind of service, or as this defines, work, perform tasks, provides assistance, therapeutic and emotional support for individuals, with disabilities. And in the guidance, they referred to that as a support animal. So what's the first one? The service animal. This is where in the past it gets really confusing for people, because a service animal is actually defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended, and it's very specific. And you'll see when you read this that it says any dog that is trained to perform a task for the benefit of the person who has a disability. And this talks about, what types of disabilities this could include. And also goes on to say that when we're talking about other types of animals, it doesn't matter. They are not service animals. Again, the ADA is very specific when it talks about what is a service animal. Now, there is an exception, and that is the miniature horse. Haven't seen a lot of those yet trained in Nebraska, but they are also considered a service animal. And again, they are especially trained to provide the support and to provide some function for a person with a disability. And you'll see, like in this picture, the animal that is trying to insert the card in the card reader, and I'm like, so does he know the PIN code? And I should say, we didn't start out by saying that, but if you have questions, please let them know. I don't know if how to post that, and we'll answer all those like at the end of this. So certainly, if you have questions, please post them. Oh, I should go back and say, with the ADA, I mean, the ADA again is service dogs, and that is not the Fair Housing Act, because the Fair Housing Act is what talks about reasonable accommodation for disability. When a lot of times, I mean, for the ADA, we're talking about access to government buildings, or having a service dog to be able to go into a restaurant or other public accommodations, those types of places. That's what the ADA addresses. And again, the Fair Housing Act, which is what we're talking about mostly, has to do with the reasonable accommodation request for disability in the realm of being a support animal, emotional support animal. So this is what I've shown here, is an actual screenshot of what's in this 19-page guidance piece, which I do have the links for all of this on the last slide. So if you want to take a photo of that when I get there to show you where that is, as well as some other pieces. So in that guidance, so this is how it starts out, is that it leads you through the questions to ask and then where you go from there. Now, one of the things you'll see on all of this are the footnotes. Like this one has 17, 18, 19, 20, that will lead you to, at the bottom, like additional guidance, or the actual case they're talking about, like case law if there has been, or where the law itself resides, what section, where you can find it. So then this section again goes into the reasonable accommodation, and it only asks one question. Have they requested a reasonable accommodation? And that accommodation request being that they need to have an animal in connection with their physical or mental impairment or disability. Someone saying, I have an emotional support animal. I have a therapy animal. I need to have this therapy animal to live in my apartment. So then this is what you get. If the answer to the question in the last page is yes, it goes into this next section and gives you again more guidance and definitions of what is being talked about. And like you'll see under observable and non-observable disabilities, where again, you have more examples of what that can be, what that includes. A lot more helpful than, say, some of the things we've had in the past, the guidance where it doesn't quite expand it as much as this one has. And you'll see that, like on, question 6, it notes, it says provided information that reasonably supports. And so if you think that the person has given you the documentation that supports that they have a need for the emotional support animal, the assistance animal, then you can go to 7. However, if you're not sure about the documentation that you've received, then it will, goes to this, about the information that they have provided. Now, under the second bullet point on this page, it talks about, directing the person, if the answer is no, about, helping them out, directing them to additional information. Another guidance piece on understanding what the reasonable accommodation request is when it comes to an emotional support animal, therapy animal, and what they need to provide. What's important about this, and all of it when it comes to reasonable accommodation, is what's known as the interactive process, meaning that if you have a tenant who says that they need to have an emotional support animal, or one of the other words for that, and you just say no, that's a problem. Could be a problem. I mean, a lot of places, like if you don't allow pets normally, you have to make an exception. Well, or you may have to, shouldn't say have to, may have to make an exception when it comes to an emotional support animal. Part of the interactive process also is, so someone provides you, documentation, and you think it looks suspicious, like one of those web created documents, which I'll talk a little bit about. You interact with them to say, yeah, I need some more information, or I need clarification. It's, the give and take, back and forth, to trying to determine, like, if what they've given you is adequate, or if you need additional information, the interactive process. And again, this guidance piece, if you have it with you, it'll help guide you through that. So then that documentation from the internet, this is from, again, that guidance piece directly to talk about that, because this has been an issue for the last several years that's popped up a lot, because there are places that will, say for $55, we will give you blah, 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 blah. This talks about what is considered reasonable documentation, and talks about having that connection between the provider and the individual making the request, and showing that there is a connection between those two. I like to use examples, and my best example for this is 2 different cases that I had, both of them involving denial of a reasonable accommodation request for emotional support animal, and both of them using internet generated documentation. The first one, the person who provided the documentation, when I did a little research into it, was an anesthesiologist from Hawaii. No, real, and they didn't ever meet with the person, never talk to them, and it's an anesthesia, you know what I just said, anesthesiologist from Hawaii. The second one, when I looked into it, the person was actually a licensed mental health practitioner, licensed in Nebraska, and I could find those. In addition, that person had met with the individual 3 times. Now, this is before COVID, and that's one of the considerations now, that absolutely it can be legitimate when they have that kind of connection, to be someone who can provide that professional opinion, or the documentation saying, yes, they need this animal, as an assistance or support animal. more information on that. And again, this is directly from that guidance piece. So if you haven't seen it, this is what you're going to find. And again, it talks about where this can come from and having that relation or the connection between them. Now, something else that I didn't put in here is that this also talks about the different types of animals, because for an emotional support animal, it can be basically any type of normal animal pet. Well, my definition of normal and someone else's might be different, like a snake or a mouse. They can be. And so it also talks about that. There was another example that's in the documentation, which for time I'm not going to go into, of a completely different type of animal. It's a capuchin monkey, and talking about what it provides. While it provided a specific service, it's still not a service animal, because again, a service animal is a dog. Again, yeah, it's confusing. So here are those resources that I talked about of where you can find the guidance pieces. And these are, downloadable. You can print them off as PDFs to have them. They're, very helpful. So if you haven't, and also include my information at the end. So if you don't get a chance to get this and you want the information, let me know. So COVID-19, I'm switching over quickly. And what I've gone through are just a series of questions and answers. And if you've heard this, seen this, just hang with me. So one of the questions that we've had way at the beginning was, if someone who has a tenant who is diagnosed, or they think the tenant was, can they request confirmation or tell other tenants? No. It's just like with reasonable accommodation for disability. While the housing provider has the right to know what symptoms are being ameliorated or alleviated by providing the reasonable accommodation, they have no right to know what the actual disability is. And this is the same thing. And you absolutely cannot disclose that to another tenant. You cannot say the tenant in so-and-so has this condition. Certainly there are steps you want to take, though, if you do find out, to let the entire place know, please make sure you're following, such and such guidelines. Can I evict someone? Again, no. Again, that goes for any medical condition. That went kind of fast, but it's okay because I'm running out of time. And what about cleaning areas? What do I do? How do I go about this? There is help to know what that is. You can call the health department and they will help you. They have a hotline, which I've listed. CDC also has guidance for how to properly disinfect your areas and for employees to do it. And even for tenants, this is good information to have when you're not sure. And then again, as the housing provider, what are my responsibilities for disinfecting a tenant's apartment? I'm hearing someone else's in my ear here. Sorry. So again, there's information and help for this so that you know where you can go. How do you stop it? And here are some, again, suggestions for how to do that. And this comes from the CDC. The frequently, and I like, it's posting signs for the limiting number of people in elevators. I don't think about elevators that often, except when I'm at work, or the number of people that can be in a laundry room at the same time. Simple things like that and steps that you can take. There, I ran through the COVID-19 things really, really quickly. And so again, if you want that information, or you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint, I'd be more than happy to provide that. Here's my information. And again, also, if you're interested in having any kind of trainings, we provide those. You can contact me directly or our main office number. So there you go. Thank you.
All good information. And please, as you said, please post your questions and we'll get to them at the end. Next up, we have Vic Klafter, who's a community organizer for Nebraska Appleseed and the collaborative project Collective Impacts Lincoln. This project focuses on leadership development in Lincoln's core neighborhoods with a policy focus of tenant protections and affordable housing development and access. Vic has been in this role for about a year, but has been involved with Nebraska Appleseed in a variety of capacities over the past 3 years. He can now attest that all of Appleseed's programmatic work intersects with and is impacted by matters of housing rights. Vic is motivated by resident leaders' aha moments when they realize they have power and expertise to advocate for themselves and their communities, especially around the fundamental belief that everyone needs and deserves to have a home. Vic, please enlighten us.
Thanks, Joe. So my name's Vic, as Joe was saying, and I am privileged to work in this program that I'm going to describe a little bit more from that precursor that Joe gave called Collective Impact Lincoln. And I'm going to talk about the intersections of eviction, affordable housing as an ongoing issue, especially as I experience it here in Lincoln, but related to Nebraska more largely, and how COVID-19 laid bare some of the gaps within that. So other Joe, you can go to the next slide. So these are the points I'll try to hit, talking about what Nebraska Appleseed is, what is Collective Impact Lincoln, our long-term housing work in the policy field, our shorter-term evictions response that was provoked by the COVID-19 crisis, and then what I'd hope for you to take away. And yeah, reiterating, if you have questions or comments, please share those in the questions and chat options. So next slide, please. So Nebraska Appleseed is a nonprofit, and we work for justice and opportunity for all Nebraskans is the skinny of it. And we have 4 major issue areas of child welfare, immigration, healthcare access, and economic justice. And those are 4 really big issues, and especially the economic justice, a lot falls within that. That is not as necessarily explicitly stated here, but housing is definitely within that realm. And Nebraska Appleseed is a little unique as this kind of organization because we have 3 different strategy options. So we do our primary one, I would say, is our legislative work. But that is informed by our organizing. So what I'm doing on a typical day-to-day is talking to residents, talking to neighbors and community leaders, and just trying to keep a really tight pulse on what are our communities needing, what are they doing, what kind of ideas are happening about how to address issues that are both defined and identified by the community members themselves. And so in addition, though, to our organizing and legislative strategies, we also have a legal team. And so we're in this mission of making sure that our policies, our laws, are not only reflective of the actual needs of our communities, and we do so by direct input from our community members, but then if the bodies responsible for those laws being implemented and executed aren't doing the job that we would want them to do, we're able to bring in a legal strategy to hold our systems accountable and to make sure that the goal is actually achieved in a practical and meaningful way. And yeah, Joe, you can go to the next slide. So Collective Impact Lincoln, the program in which I specifically work, is a partnership of ourselves, Nebraska Appleseed, Civic Nebraska, and the South of Downtown Community Development Organization. And I love this project because we all bring a little bit different flavor to the collaborative, yet our mission is aligned on resident leadership and development, as well as the policy work that, again, directly reflects what we learn from the community members with which we are involved. And so, like I said, this is focused on Lincoln and especially on 6 core neighborhoods in Lincoln, that being Hartley, University Place, Belmont and Clinton, and the near South and Everett neighborhoods. However, we do work with folks beyond those areas as well. Next slide. So like I was saying, focus on resident leadership and leadership development. This is, we at our base, we support neighborhood community conversations, leadership and action opportunities to help create a more vibrant and inclusive place to live, and we believe in resident-led change. And we do some of this. So for this project has completed its 3rd year, and so it's fairly new relatively. But in that time, we've done a lot of deep canvassing and conversations with residents. But then we're also supporting neighborhood projects, leadership training through these things we call community builder workshops that, again, we hear what an issue is that people would like to talk about and try to help solve, or developing their own leadership to address an issue. And then we offer that kind of training. Also action committees, if there's a specific issue like that's time sensitive or that arises kind of out of nowhere, responding to that. And then researching our policy and advocating for systemic change. This will become clear as well as Margie was talking about the way that her agency is responsible for making sure that the people are following the law. And Abbi, the panelist coming after me, will be sharing some of similar sentiments. Nebraska Appleseed and CIL, or Collective Impact Lincoln, we're in this mission of making sure that the laws themselves are reflective. And all of these dynamics that how we approach our work made us somewhat uniquely situated as a collective to respond to the evictions crisis as it loomed large. So you can go to the next slide. So before I talk about evictions, I'd like to give the preface for we've done the long term of our housing policy work, which is something that has been clear to us as an issue for years, but has definitely taken on an urgency this year. So we plan to continue our long-term fight while also being responsive to the needs of folks in this moment. Next slide. So in this long-term housing policy work, we've identified 3 policy priorities at the moment. And these are ideas that we find we have gleaned or have identified through that canvassing that I was mentioning, research and insight from national partners looking at similarly situated towns and cities, and looking at how they've addressed some similar issues, and then the Affordable Housing Coordinated Action Plan that the City of Lincoln had commissioned late last year, and then the draft was released in February of this year, and that provided a lot of really great research and data and analysis about the housing situation in Lincoln and the needs anticipated over the next 5 to 10 years. And I will say that within that coordinated action plan, some of the most benefit also to us was what we found was missing in terms of the solutions offered for especially the low income and very low income tenants in Lincoln. And so through a combination of those strategies, we resulted in 3 primary priority policy goals, and those being proactive code enforcement, inclusionary housing, and increased efficacy of vouchers. And so we care about maintaining the current housing stock that we have. We don't want to lose more housing, especially affordable housing, to dilapidation, to unable to keep up maintenance, as well as upholding humane housing as a primary value of what we want from our housing situation in Lincoln. Inclusionary housing to support the development of new housing, and supporting developers as well as then landowners to keep bolstering our stock. And then increasing the efficacy of voucher use. And this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail. And especially as it is incredibly relevant right now. So Joe, you can go to the next slide. So earlier this year, and I imagine that quite a number of you on this presentation were aware of this legislation. It was Legislative Bill 1020, And this would have banned rental discrimination against potential tenants based solely on their use of a housing voucher, and this would have taken effect statewide if it had moved forward, partly due to disruptions to the legislative session because of the pandemic. It did not advance, but this issue of folks with housing vouchers being turned away from the application because a landlord property manager has decided as a rule, as a blanket rule, they do not accept housing vouchers. This issue that the door was kind of shut to people with housing vouchers at many properties only really increased in relevance. And that's of a couple of reasons. One, because of the economic hardship that was caused and is continued to be caused by the pandemic, but also because of different funds available via federal assistance, such as the CARES Act, but then also through other grants and other avenues, that there's more opportunity for some of our direct care providers, as well as they work in tandem with agencies like the Lincoln Housing Authority, to provide more vouchers. A direct care provider here in town just recently got a grant, and they will be able to house 140 more households, and thus it becomes this issue of where will those folks go when there isn't enough housing that will actually take those vouchers that then would help families get housing, especially in a time such as this, when it's really important for people to be able to stay housed and not live in congregative living. And from our research, I've identified that this issue most affects people with disabilities, single female heads of household, families with children, and members of racial minority groups. And the collation of a few of those dynamics, also noting that moms who are moms of color with children and with disabilities are definitely feel the fallout of this lack of protection the most. And you can go to the next slide. So then this launches into or relates to the eviction crisis, and as spurred by and as sustained by COVID-19. And if people are aware of some of the case numbers that UNMC was talking about the other day, it unfortunately is not going away anytime soon here in Nebraska. Next slide. Let's see here. I think you might have, there we go. Thanks, Joe. So here's just a quick timeline of eviction moratoria as it related, and kind of also to demonstrate some of the gaps that were exposed. So March 25th, Governor Ricketts instituted an executive order that was a specific eviction moratorium for evictions of non-payment, and the non-payment was related to COVID-19, either loss of income through being laid off, or a business closure, having to care for someone, a child, or being sick with COVID-19, or having to care for someone who's sick with COVID-19. And that was set for to go through May 31st. March 27th, President Trump had signed the CARES Act, the iteration of the CARES Act that had a moratorium for certain covered properties. And that was for essentially properties with a federally backed mortgage or were participating in a number of housing programs. And both of those together, if implemented completely across the board without imperfection, would have covered a lot. However, it was not, they were not, and they did put a fair bit of burden on knowing about them in order for a tenant who's facing eviction to advocate for themselves. And unfortunately, there were a lot of gaps opened up through which tenants, which people were evicted. So then May 31st was when the governor's executive order expires, and he did not replace with a different moratorium. And then July 24th is when the CARES Act moratorium expired. The hope for a second CARES Act with more substantial rental assistance has been stalled. There has been rental assistance from that initial CARES Act that has been slowly kind of coming through different means of administration. So there is some rental assistance available. However, we've been knowing through some of our community organizing as well that there's been more difficulties faced by accessing those funds than we would hope for in order to make it efficient so that tenants are able to pay their bills, landlords are able to receive the rent in a meaningful and a sustaining way. September 4th is when the most recent, the big kind of act that definitely blindsided pretty much everyone in the housing advocacy and just housing management world. The CDC actually published a moratorium that was an eviction on all non-payment evictions. And this was coming from the cause of public health, primarily identifying that it was an attempt to, and within the CDC's power, to stall or slow people moving into congregative living situations. So going into a shelter, moving in with family or friends, doubling up, or being unsheltered homeless on the street. So today, we have fewer evictions than we would have had. I will say that with confidence, without these measures and definitely without the CDC moratorium. However, coming back to that piece of more rental assistance, the CDC moratorium expires December 31st. And the last thing that any of us want, I know, is for a wave of evictions to happen in the middle of winter in Nebraska. And there is efforts ongoing to advocate for the money to flow, for bills to be covered. But at this point, it's really important that the protection that is offered is equitably and consistently applied in the courthouse to make sure the evictions that should not be happening under these protections don't. So that leads to the next slide. Collective Impact Lincoln and Appleseed helped play a role in our evictions response here in Lincoln. And I'm sure folks on here have heard about, and this is thankfully this project has received a fair bit of attention because it deserves to. The TAP, or the Tenant Assistance Project, that was established formally in May, is led by the UNL Civil Law Clinic, the Nebraska State Bar Association Volunteer Lawyers Project, and the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. And the city of Lincoln has been welcoming and behind this effort to sustain this project in order to provide limited legal representation to tenants facing eviction at the courthouse. And legal aid has been providing much support as well in their typical wheelhouse as well, and has been a critical teammate in this project as well. Now that the CDC moratorium is in effect, the outreach efforts for the Tenant Assistance Project and for the moratorium have become all the more important, which I think highlights something that is generally a rule when it comes to this kind of policy, is that if people don't know about it, whether it's a landlord or a tenant, it is a recipe for misunderstanding and sometimes disaster and sometimes just illegality. And so making sure that people know about it is a core of how we are helping to sustain it. And I think that's also something relevant that Abby, the next panelist, is going to touch on too, that people have to know about the protections available to them, especially when the burden is on them, in order to assert that equitably and honestly. And we continue to advocate to the governor for accessible and significant rental assistance. There is some money available, and we want to free that up to come into the pockets of tenants, to then go into the pockets of those who are maintaining and owning the units that they live in. We don't want to lead to a downturn in the ability for smaller, especially smaller landlords or whoever, to be able to manage the properties they currently have. And evictions happen outside of COVID-19, absolutely. I think that the TAP has exposed that addressing this legal power imbalance between tenants and landlords, it will remain relevant. From the conversations we have with community leaders and community members, often individuals who have language barriers or to a lot of new Americans, but also just generally folks who have felt and are disenfranchised by different systemic means, things related to past evictions, criminal record, income generally, they are much more susceptible to agreeing to a predatory or unfair agreement with a landlord outside of the court, or are susceptible to kind of illegal or outside of the court evictions entirely, than those who are aware that, okay, there is a process for this. Tenant holds responsibility, absolutely, as a CDC moratorium does not cancel, reduce rent at all. If they don't know about the process and how it can work, and also that they have someone who at least can explain that, if not even provide limited legal representation, it definitely places a very heavy weight or ball in the court of the landlord to take actions. And this underscored that low-income women of color, especially those with children, are evicted more than anyone else. And so that underscores this importance of race and gender equity in housing, as it relates also to that increased efficacy of voucher use. Because people aren't even able to get the voucher, to use the voucher in the first place, and they are the ones who, that group of people are the ones who benefit most from vouchers, but are also boxed out of being able to use them the most. Then they are also at more risk of eviction, and it's a compounding effect that then places a group of people who are already vulnerable to these gaps even more so. Which then I think leads directly into my takeaway. You can go to the next slide, Joe. So connecting these pieces together, next slide. The same people who are evicted the most are most affected by this systemic barriers to affordable housing. This is not a new takeaway. This is relevant in periods of segregative housing being legal. This is in periods of redlining. This is continued and is tied together as well with also what Margie's talking about with reasonable accommodations for folks with disabilities. And I believe also what Abby's going to talk about too. We have to be sensitive and attuned to the compounding effects of people's vulnerabilities to make sure that they're treated fairly in housing, because housing is a need. I know that I started thinking about housing in terms of the right to live indoors. And when we think about it that way, it seems really basic and essential. And so as all this fits together, I think that we can hold the value of people need shelter. And so as we sort through all the details of the policies, I think holding that at the forefront, and as we try to work together as a team, as property providers or housing providers, as well as advocates for those who don't have as much of a voice at the table making these decisions. So go to the next slide, Joe. I believe it's my last. So these are just some links to where you can find more about evictions, especially as it relates to how CIL and our collective has been responding. So more about Collective Impact Lincoln as well, Nebraska Appleseed, and then there's my email. I'm always open for more conversations. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can have ideas. You can really tell me whatever. I welcome it. I welcome conversation and dialogue. So thank you so much. I hope that I didn't run over too much time.
No, thank you, Vic. Good information and good work that you and Appleseed are doing. Once again, please submit your questions if you have any, and we'll get to them at the end. But until then, our next speaker, Abbi Swatsworth, is the Executive Director of OutNebraska, a statewide education and advocacy organization that is working to celebrate and empower thriving LGBTQIA+ communities. With a degree in social work, more than 20 years of nonprofit experience with marginalized communities, and her lived experience as a survivor in recovery, she brings an important perspective to her work. Abbi is a member of the Lincoln Rotary number 14, serves on the Mayor's Commission on Women, and serves on the Leadership Council of Hugh Springs. Abbi, it's all yours.
Thank you. I did not present a PowerPoint today, so hopefully you can see my webcam and my presentation. I'm going to be addressing housing discrimination for the LGBTQIA+ community. I'll start with a little bit about OutNebraska, who we are and what we do. You heard our mission, which is to celebrate and empower LGBTQIA+ community members across Nebraska. We do that in a variety of ways. We celebrate our culture through community building activities. We host a film festival every year and other community building activities that allow folks to make connections with each other outside of bar settings and to build that social capital of having connections and support relationships. Then we educate both nonprofits, businesses, and government organizations about inclusivity and serving or staffing LGBTQIA+ people. And also our community about civic engagement, the importance of voting, how to be a part of the policymaking process, writing letters to the editor or other civic engagement activities that folks can get engaged in to make a difference in their communities. And certainly LGBTQIA+ people are sometimes left out of civic life. And so this work is really important in empowering our community. And then thirdly, we do advocate for policies that are pro-LGBTQIA+, policies that will advance our community and their well-being across the state of Nebraska. Our ultimate goal is to improve the quality of life for folks in Nebraska through those activities of education, celebration, and advocacy. So why is it important to talk about housing discrimination as it relates to this particular community? As you heard from both Margie and Vic, housing discrimination happens, it's real, and we know that it is happening in Nebraska. The Movement Advancement Project estimates that there are 67,000 LGBTQIA+ people living in Nebraska. Those are folks ages 13 and above. And through research, they also estimate that 32% of LGBTQ+ adults are also raising children. So any impacts that families face, LGBTQIA+ people also face. This community cuts across all socioeconomic status, all racial, immigration status, disability, ability status. We are found everywhere. We live everywhere in Nebraska, not just in the metro areas, but also across our state, and rural folks are also identifying as LGBTQIA+. Homelessness is a huge issue for LGBTQ+ youth. As much as 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify on the LGBTQ+ spectrum, and family rejection is a huge issue that's causing that. But in terms of adults facing discrimination, housing is definitely an area where they are having issues. And as Vic said, everyone has the right, or should have the right, to live indoors. And so it's very important that we sort of talk about this community and their civil rights. This summer, in June, the Supreme Court heard a case called the Bostock case that was primarily dealing with employment and whether or not you could discriminate in employment on the basis of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity as it relates to discrimination because of sex. And in that case, they found a majority of courts, justices, thinking of the language there, found that it was because of sex if you discriminate due to sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, that distinction is really important because it makes that kind of discrimination illegal in Nebraska. Unfortunately, Nebraska is not one of the 21 states that specifically outlines protections for discrimination in state statute. So unfortunately, we did not have and still do not have state statute that outlines that protection. But the Bostock case did then roll across the land and make it illegal to discriminate in employment. The Nebraska Equal Opportunities Commission, following that ruling, did make a statement that they would also consider housing cases under the same ruling, because in Nebraska, housing statutes talk about discrimination as a result of sex and have very, very similar language to that of employment. And so the Nebraska Equal Opportunities Commission has stated that they will consider sexual orientation or gender identity cases under sex, which means that it is now illegal to discriminate on that basis in housing in addition to employment. And Nebraska's actually leading the way in this. They were one of the very early states to make this statement, and several other states have followed since. We also expect there will be future cases that come forward on this. And the most important thing that we can do right now is to let people know that they have recourse, right? Because most folks don't realize that the Nebraska Equal Opportunities Commission has taken this stance. So I'm really happy to see that we have like that 50-50 split today between landlords and owners and advocates, because you can all get this message. If you are working with folks and they are experiencing discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity, they have recourse now. In Lincoln, you can contact the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. Across the state, anywhere in the state, folks can contact the Nebraska Equal Opportunities Commission to investigate a case and do fact finding on whether or not that discrimination was because of sex. That is probably the most important information I have to impart. If we think about members of the LGBTQIA+ community who are facing housing issues, we have a lot of the same community members that Vic already spoke about, low income folks, and the LGBTQIA+ community does have higher rates of poverty than non-LGBTQIA+ folks. That is a result of long-term systemic employment discrimination. We are hoping with the Bostock decision that folks are able to find more stable employment and have a more stable income source. But we also know that related to COVID, many community members were working in service fields like restaurants or hotels, and that they have been especially hard hit with job layoffs and furloughs, and so they are facing the same economic situations that a lot of the folks that Vic spoke of are also facing. If we also think about the intersection of race and gender and sexual orientation or gender identity, transgender women of color, particularly Black transgender women, are certainly at the apex of those groups that are vulnerable to housing discrimination, and they are struggling with some of the highest rates of homelessness in the LGBTQIA+ community. So it's especially important that we get the word out about the recourse to have cases heard, so that folks can find stable housing, which leads them to the ability of finding stable employment and further their life and livelihoods, and allow them to be productive members of our community, which is what everyone wants. I didn't prepare the PowerPoint, but you can just Google the NEOC if you'd like to see. Their statement about this case was in the Omaha World Herald in June. If you want to read the article, you can track that down. Also offer them as a resource to folks. I am happy to take questions. My email is Abbi, ABBI, at OutNebraska.org. I'm not a direct service provider. As an education and advocacy organization, we can serve as a resource and point people in the direction of resources, but we don't do any housing services ourselves. My presentation today is brief because I hope the situation is pretty clear. You cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in housing or employment. Now, whether or not we get state statute may be important as we see the makeup of the court possibly changing. We will continue to advocate for that state statutes, and there are certainly gaps in the ruling that need to be fulfilled. There is a federal act, the Equality Act, that could make this the law of the land across the land. That would certainly, if Congress takes action on that, make a big difference as well. But right now, that court ruling and the NEOC has made it possible for folks to have recourse on these issues. And I am happy to take questions at this point. And I know that we're ending up a little early, but hopefully there are questions out there that the three of us can answer.
Thank you so much. If the rest of the speakers will share their cameras again and unmute themselves, we will move on to questions. We only have a couple of them, so if there's anybody who thinks of a question but hasn't typed it in yet, please go ahead. Our first question, I think we answered. Do you have a link to the report for the ADA guidance on the therapeutic animals? We let them know that that was in Margie's PowerPoint, which we'll make available on NIFA.org. And this was also posted while Margie was speaking. If somebody has a doctor's note for an emotional support animal, does that waive the pet deposit that that buildings require?
Absolutely. If someone has an emotional support animal, assistance animal, whatever you want to call them, the housing provider, cannot charge either a deposit or a monthly fee for having that emotional support animal.
Very good. This one came up while Vic was speaking. Do you have any data on how many landlords ignored the governor's executive order since it was not a mandate? I'm wondering if anyone paid attention to it.
Yeah. So I don't have the clear-cut data on that. From witnessing how it went down at the courthouse and the necessity of the tenant assistance project, it was a combination of landlords maybe not following it or knowing about it, but then also a practicing or implementation of the eviction or the executive order by the judge and judges in Nebraska that we felt could have been improved or could be more in line with what we felt that the executive order was trying to accomplish. So it was a combined effect of landlords maybe disregarding it, and then, like I said, kind of imperfect, and what we could have felt was a very much a lot of opportunity for improvement for how it was implemented by the judges.
All right, well, it doesn't look like any other questions rolled in, so unless anybody has any last thoughts to include you, Joe, off in the abyss.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And I just want to have folks aware as well that Abbi had mentioned the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission and the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights as organizations to investigate discrimination in housing. My organization does so as well. I'm at the Fair Housing Center of Nebraska and Iowa. We cover all of Nebraska and all of Iowa. We investigate discrimination allegations as well and work closely with the NEOC and Margie's organization. The biggest difference between our two organizations is that, like Margie said, her organization is a fact-finding, neutral third party, where my organization can act as an advocate on behalf of that client. So we can approach landlords asking them directly for that reasonable accommodation or find out what the deal is so that we can come to a mutual agreement. We're a nonprofit. We're based out of Omaha, like I said, and we cover all of Nebraska and Iowa. So that's another resource. Our phone number is 402-934-6675. So absolutely feel free to give us a call. Two of us are bilingual in Spanish, and we also run a testing program. That's a whole nother session that, Joe, you're going to have to bring me back on, so I can explain that later. But
Sounds good.
I also, because there's a 50-50 split, I also do outreach and education, and I encourage landlords, housing providers to give me a call. I will never tell a landlord how to run their business, but I will tell you, you can give me a call and run a scenario by me. And I can tell you what the law is and what your options are. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And the other thing is we offer landlord tenant assistance, not assistance. We counsel individuals on landlord tenant issues. So if individuals have an issue with their landlord and they're not making repairs and they want to know if they can withhold this month's rent until the landlord makes that repair, the answer to that obviously is no, you can't. But there's ways about going about getting that fixed, and we counsel individuals on that type of their rights and what the landlord's responsible for. So please feel free to contact us, just as well as any one of the Vic or Margie or Abby's organization, as well as, because we're all in this doing the same work. We want the same outcome. So please feel free to reach out to any one of us.
All right, well, thank you all again. We had excellent turnout today. Looks like over 125 people showed up, which is a testament to how important this subject matter is. So thank you so much. Moving on to a bit of general housekeeping. NYFA is proud to sponsor Legal Aid of Nebraska's virtual luncheon tomorrow, which will feature a discussion with Matthew Desmond, author of Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. He is an excellent speaker, and it should be fantastic as well. And a week from today at this time, we'll be hosting a special edition of Networking with NYFA. The topic is domestic violence, and our speakers are Lee Heflebauer, Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence, Hillary Wasserberger from the Doves Program, Linda Olson from Bright Horizons, and Lisa Drogi from Friendship Home. It'll be a great session, so don't forget to register at nyfa.org for this and the upcoming events. And yes, I should mention that the Legal Aid Luncheon tomorrow has a registration close, so hopefully you already have your tickets. Thanks again to Margie, Vic, Abby, and Joe. Thank you to everybody who turned out today. Again, this recording and the slides will be available at nyfa.org, and the video will be on our YouTube page, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.